Hey everyone, Juan Dhas here, and welcome back to this week's YouTube lesson. And today we're going to be talking about reframing, a little bit of a concept that I've been toying around with for the past year. Especially, I'll get into the finer details of it a little more, but I did also want to just kind of convey this as something that maybe might help people who are stuck in a couple of ruts in their playing, or people who maybe need that extra push just to kind of get a solo that is a little more, or an aspect of their playing a little more integrated and sounding a little more musically inclined. By the way, yes, we do have a new camera setup going. I'm testing it out, just seeing how it works. I'm still figuring out settings, so please do bear with me. But I'm excited to see how this will pan out for future videos. So let's just dive straight into the lesson. And I remember it was when I got to Dubai, and I was starting to mess around with, a couple of different ideas, a couple of different things, and work with some different people. And my mentor at the time had said, one of your greatest assets is your technical facility. However, one of your greatest limiting factors and your cage essentially is also your technical facility. So since then, my study or my practice has been kind of devoted to playing around with this concept. And what I realized was I had to reframe how I use my technique entirely. Now, interestingly, I was talking about this with a student in a lesson yesterday. And this can apply to any composition, any piece, or really any function, right? So what do I mean by this? For example, the student was doing more of a groove-based, I can't remember if it was a piece of his or something else, but it was mostly groove-based. Unfortunately, the whole tune had become groove-based, and it had created a flat line. Now this involves actually looking at kind of the psychology of how we play, or how we look at certain concepts or certain ideas, right? What is very common for players, especially those who have some sort of technical facility, is to kind of only lean into their strength. So for example, let's say if I have a line, or just, my general technical facility, which can be, right, just running the lines up and down, or, taking, if I stick with that kind of D, B minor key, like, right? Running ideas up and down, right? Running up and down, kind of our natural tendency as musicians and instrumentalists is to kind of lean into the thing we do best, which is great. After all, I'm one of the firm believers of you should lean into your strengths. You should. It's something that is inherently a part of you and is a part of your playing. So what's the catch? Well, let's put it in this context. When and I kind of changed my approach in the video I uploaded earlier in the week with the canon test, and just the backing I did on Patreon, which was the intro for this video. What ends up happening is that by leaning into your strength so much, essentially what happens is you create a flatline dynamic, or you create, a single sound, which is great for social media. Excuse the plane overhead. It's great for social media. You have a minute to show the world what you can do, essentially, which is one way of looking at it. But lately I've been valuing that idea of restraint a lot more, and it's kind of led me to create more interesting moments in my playing. Now, if it's a 1 minute or less video, that's understandable. You've got a finite amount of time, and our natural tendency, especially as guitar players, is to throw everything and the kitchen sink into this video. But what if we translate this to a different context? And sure, it might not be happening a lot right now, like gigs. What if you're playing a 1 hour gig and you've got a solo on every tune, or nearly every tune? What if you're playing a 2 hour gig and it's 2 sets, or maybe it's one really long set? I've had gigs where I've had to play that. Or, you know, what if there are 3 or 4 sets and you're taking solos in every set? If you're, let's say, a more technically proficient guitar player, I'm just using this as one example because it's one that's close to me. You know, I spent a lot of time working on my technique and cultivating it. That can get very boring for the person listening, because you're not creating any peaks and valleys of interest in the solos. And especially when you look at this from a more macro lens, from tune to tune, this suddenly starts presenting a couple of difficulties. Let's look at it from a different lens. What if you're playing on a recording? I think that's a lot more universal considering our current circumstances, even though gigs are popping up here and there around the world. A recording, you can't play all the way through. Maybe for that tune, you could. Maybe the producer or the artist you're working for wants you to blast for 30 seconds and just play every line or every, you know, right? Play lines up and down, or just have you completely go nuts because that suits the aesthetic. But let's again zoom out. What if you were playing on an EP or an album and you have multiple solos to take? You have to vary your content a little more, and you have to vary your dynamic approach to each solo, because this helps craft something that is a lot more musical. And now we're getting into the actual creative options that you have as an improviser. So this is all well and good. Like, we've covered a bit of the psychology behind it and some of the interesting things in terms of, okay, how can we think differently? So what is the concept of reframing? And I want you to kind of, it's basically, essentially, to put it in layman's terms, it's less is more. But I find for some people, less is more doesn't really stick and needs a bit more of an explanation to kind of stick, for lack of a better choice of words. And the idea is as follows. If you are so good at something that it comes through in your playing no matter what, and you use it too much, it becomes oversaturated. It's like taking a lot of salt. Salt is a great thing, especially with measure. It brings out a flavor profile in food. But if you just completely throw in all the salt and all the pepper in the world, the dish becomes overwhelming, almost to the point of being inedible. When we translate this to guitar or music, too many chops can become oversaturated. Why? Because the ears are oversaturated with information. This can be even extended to something further. Let's say I take an entire solo. I'm going to use a tune. Let's say, off the top of my head, Beautiful Love, okay? But let's say my approach is exclusively wide intervals. I'm trying to just kind of piece something together, but you see the point I'm making. Now that for maybe a short amount of time is okay, but if you do that chorus after chorus, it gets very intense. What if you use too much rhythm? Like your playing is too rhythmically based and you're starting to kind of drift from the overall context of the piece. Let's say our context is a swing. 1, 2, 2, 3, 4. It's maybe too aggressive, or maybe it's not aggressive enough and it's too floaty. It's hard for the listener to latch onto. Again, you've got to have contrasts in your playing. Essentially, that's what reframing is. It's just kind of a contrast, but I want to apply this so that it highlights your individual strengths as a musician. So there I've given a couple of examples, or it could even be like, great, maybe you might be listening to this and thinking, okay, I don't have chops, but you might have chordal vocabulary. If I play every chord substitution under the sun on this tune, am I helping bring the tune out, or am I kind of just imposing too much of myself? You see how this becomes a bit of an issue. So I'm going to leave you guys with an exercise, and I'm going to dive into it maybe a little deeper on the Patreon page if you want to dive into the extended lesson. But the exercise essentially is kind of a variation on a limitation exercise, which I've talked about in detail before. I'm going to put the link up here somewhere. And essentially, what I want you to do is force yourself into a corner. It's going to be a little difficult, and especially because it's taking the one thing you're good at, or maybe one of the many things you're good at, one thing that's maybe a little more defining of your character as a musician. I want you to take that and then go force yourself, maybe I'm only going to use it in one section. So let's take a tune like Beautiful Love, for example. I'm going to take Beautiful Love, and then I'm going to only play chops, so to speak, in the B section. Ready? So, pretty easy tempo. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. There. Back to melody. Remember, this is a BAC technically. So that's one variation of the exercise. You can take a specific section and say, okay, I'm only going to use chops in that section. Again, same thing. Now I'm only going to use chops on the, I'm just using this for the sake of example. I'm only going to do this on the first A. Ready? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Or maybe let's say, okay, different approach. Melody. Melody again. As in playing melody, not the literal melody. Chops. Sorry, I haven't really played all day, but you get the point. In that I'm deliberately forcing myself into this. Maybe if I left this totally open for interpretation, it would be much easier for me to get through the tune. But why? I'm essentially forcing myself into autopilot mode and not really thinking so much about the conscious choices I'm making as a musician and as an improviser. Whereas now, when I'm being forced to approach a certain section in a very specific manner, and maybe forcing one of my assets, let's say, into a box, I have to be much more careful about how to navigate the environment. Let's take a different context. Let's say your strength is highly rhythmic phrasing, and you want to kind of lock into that a little more. Or maybe you want to rely on it a little less. So let's take a tune like Beautiful Love. Let's say second B section, that's where I can get really rhythmic. Up, two, 3. First A. Rhythm. Out. Chops. Or let's say a little more flamboyant in the phrasing, right? You get the idea. You can come up with different scenarios, but the point is, I'm asking you to force yourself into a rough situation. It's going to be uncomfortable, but then again, that's why the practice session is the practice session. You don't want to be too comfortable in your practice session. You want to be continuously pushing yourself outside of your current boundaries and your current limits, including forcing yourself to think in very different ways. Now, I actually really enjoyed that last chorus I did on Beautiful Love. Why? Because there was contrast. Would I play that way live? No. But what it showed me is that I can switch gears and maybe be a lot more rhythmically locked in and then suddenly float a little more. Or still swing, but then maybe when I want to lock in, I get a little more aggressive. Or my attacks get shorter, and I suddenly rely a lot more on the upbeat and the syncopation. In essence, it shows me my options. And what it's allowing me to do is create peaks and valleys in my playing to gain the listener's interest, to make your solos a little more interesting. So I hope this lesson was really useful for you guys. Please let me know in the comments what you think. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Also, please do like and subscribe. It helps the channel a lot. Also, if you have any other lesson ideas that you'd like me to cover, please put them in the comments below, and I'll make a note of any interesting lesson topics that might pop up. So I'm about to jump over to Patreon right now. I will see you in the next video. Take care, guys.